The early days of the Second World War were filled with sleek, agile fighters, elegant machines that danced through the sky like predators. The British had their Spitfires, the Germans had their Messerschmitts, and the Japanese had their nimble Zeros. In that world of speed and grace, a new American fighter was about to take shape, one so heavy and unconventional that even its own pilots laughed when they first saw it. It didn't look like a fighter. It looked like a flying milk bottle, fat, bulky, and almost comically oversized. But that plane, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, would soon become one of the most feared war machines ever built. When it first rolled off the assembly line, pilots scoffed. "How is that thing supposed to fight a Messerschmitt?" they joked. Yet, by the end of the war, the P-47 would outlast them all, outclimbing, outgiving, and outsurviving nearly every plane in the sky. It was a monster that could take hits other fighters couldn't dream of surviving. It became a workhorse, a symbol of brute force and industrial dominance, a true product of American engineering at war. But this story isn't just about a plane. It's about what happens when necessity, innovation, and sheer will collide. The P-47 wasn't born beautiful. It was born from desperation, failure, and a little bit of luck. The dream that almost failed. The story begins in the late 1930s, as the clouds of war gathered once again over Europe. Republic Aviation, a relatively small company led by a brilliant designer named Alexander Kartveli, was struggling to make its mark. Kartveli was a Georgian immigrant who had fled Soviet rule and found a new home in America, a place where his imagination could finally take flight. His first big design, the P-35, had been promising but underpowered. Then came the P-43 Lancer, a modest improvement that never lived up to expectations. When the US Army Air Corps asked for a new altitude interceptor in 1940, Kartveli submitted an ambitious concept, the XP-47. But there was a problem. By the time the design reached the Air Corps, air combat had already changed. Battles over Europe were faster, deadlier, and higher than anyone anticipated. The XP-47's modest engine wouldn't stand a chance. Then came the moment that changed everything. Kartveli scrapped his plans and started over. He decided that if the enemy's fighters were getting faster and more powerful, the only solution was to go bigger, much bigger. He proposed a radical new aircraft, the XP-47B. It would be massive for a single-engine fighter, with thick armor plating, 8.50 caliber machine guns, and the biggest engine ever fitted into a fighter plane, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower monster. When he presented it, Army officials nearly laughed him out of the room. "It's too heavy, too complicated, too expensive," they said. Even Republic's own test pilots thought it was ridiculous. But Kartveli didn't back down. He knew that raw power, not agility, would decide the skies ahead. The flying jug takes shape. When the prototype finally took flight in May 1941, the results shocked everyone. Despite its size, the Thunderbolt could climb faster than expected, handle surprisingly well, and deliver devastating firepower. Its immense turbo supercharger system gave it incredible high-altitude performance, allowing it to chase enemy bombers and fighters where others couldn't follow. The plane's shape, dictated by that massive turbo system and engine, earned it a nickname among pilots, the Jug. Some said it was short for Juggernaut. Others claimed it was because it looked like a milk jug. Either way, the name fit perfectly. But not everything was smooth. The P-47B was a mechanical nightmare to maintain. Its complex ducting and heavy frame made production difficult. Yet the Army was desperate for a high-performance fighter, and with war on the horizon, the Thunderbolt was pushed into mass production. By the time the United States entered World War II, the first P-47s were rolling off the assembly line. They were big, loud, and intimidating. But no one yet knew just how legendary this aircraft would become. Baptism by fire. When the P-47 Thunderbolt first arrived in Europe in 1943, American pilots had trained in open skies, but now they faced the cold, grey expanse of Nazi-occupied Europe and the deadly precision of the Luftwaffe. The early missions were frustrating. Short-range limitations meant Thunderbolts couldn't escort bombers all the way to their targets deep in Germany. Pilots had to turn back before the bombing runs were finished, leaving the B-17s vulnerable to German fighters. Critics pounced. Too heavy, too slow, too short-legged, they said. But the P-47 had something no one fully appreciated yet: durability. During one mission, a Thunderbolt returned to base with half its tail shot off, riddled with cannon holes, leaking oil, and missing an entire cylinder, yet it still landed safely. That kind of resilience became legendary. Pilots began to trust the P-47 with their lives. They could dive from high altitude at over 500 miles per hour, unleash a storm of .50 caliber fire, and pull out of dives other fighters wouldn't survive. The Jug was proving its worth. By 1944, the Allies were advancing across Europe, and the Thunderbolt was leading the charge. From the beaches of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes, the roar of its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine became the soundtrack of liberation. German troops learned to fear that sound. They called it the Thunderbolt Scream, the whine of air rushing over the wings as the Jug dove toward its target. Moments later came the thunder. Rockets, bombs, and machine gun fire that shredded convoys, bridges, and tanks. The P-47 was no longer just a fighter. It was a flying artillery piece, fast, ruthless, and unstoppable. The war on the ground. As the Allies pushed inland after D-Day, the Thunderbolt became the tip of the spear for tactical air power. Pilots flew multiple missions a day, supporting troops, breaking up German counterattacks, and hunting anything that moved behind enemy lines. Their job was simple: make sure the enemy never slept. They strafed supply columns, ambushed trains, and even blasted communication lines to isolate enemy units. Entire panzer divisions were stalled, not by ground resistance, but by relentless attacks from Thunderbolts. One pilot later said, when the Jugs showed up, the war on the ground stopped belonging to the Germans. The Thunderbolt's reputation grew so immense that even Allied ground troops took comfort in its shadow. They'd hear that distinct engine and cheer because they knew the Jug was theirs. Survivors and legends. Every war machine leaves behind stories, but few are as unbelievable as those of the Thunderbolt. There was Lt. Joseph Powers, whose Jug lost an entire wingtip, yet still made it home. There was Capt. Bob Brawl, who once returned with half his elevator shot away, and countless others who crash-landed battered Thunderbolts and simply walked away. The plane's resilience wasn't luck. It was engineering, thick armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a radial engine that could take punishment no inline engine could match. Even when cylinders were destroyed or oil systems ruptured, that massive R-2800 often kept running long enough to bring its pilot home. In a war where so many lives depended on thin aluminum and hope, the P-47 was the closest thing to indestructible. The final push. By the time Allied forces crossed into Germany, the Thunderbolt had cemented its legacy. It had destroyed more enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat than any other US fighter except the Mustang, but on the ground, nothing even came close. Thunderbolts had reduced the Reich's transportation network to ruins. Without trains or fuel, German divisions were trapped, starving for supplies. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was now hunted prey. Even as late as April 1945, when the war was almost over, Thunderbolts were still flying strike missions, still hammering what was left of the Nazi war machine. And when the guns finally went silent, the Jug's record spoke for itself. Over 7,000 enemy aircraft destroyed, 86,000 vehicles, 9,000 locomotives, and 6,000 armored targets obliterated. It wasn't the prettiest plane. It wasn't the fastest. But it was the one that never quit. The post-war years, when peace returned, many Thunderbolts were scrapped, melted down, or sold to Allied nations. But their legend lived on. In Korea, early jets took over the skies, yet the lessons of the P-47 endured. The idea that an aircraft could dominate both the air and the battlefield below became the blueprint for modern close-air support aircraft like the A-10 Warthog, another tough, ugly, and beloved killer. In fact, the A-10's nickname, the Warthog, echoes the Jug's legacy perfectly. Both were laughed at for their size and design. Both were built around a single idea: survive anything, hit hard, and come home. What the Jug taught the world: the Thunderbolt's story isn't just about a plane. It's about what happens when raw engineering meets desperate necessity. When the war began, pilots dreamed of sleek, nimble fighters. But by the war's end, they trusted the brute that could take a hit and keep flying. The Thunderbolt proved that survival, not elegance, wins wars. It also showed the world the power of industrial scale. America's ability to produce thousands of these beasts, to arm them, fuel them, and keep them flying, became one of the great advantages of the Allied victory. In many ways, the P-47 was the embodiment of that victory. Massive, unstoppable, and built for endurance. A final reflection: today, the few Thunderbolts that still fly do so as living thunder, reminders of a time when the sky itself. When you see one climb and hear that deep growl of the R-2800, you're not just hearing an engine. You're hearing history roar back to life, the sound of men who once crossed the channel knowing they might not return, and the machines that brought them home anyway. The P-47 Thunderbolt was mocked, misunderstood, and feared. It started as a punchline and ended as a legend. It wasn't the plane anyone expected, but it became the plane everyone needed. And that's why, when the story of air power in World War II is told, when the legends of the sky are counted, the Jug will always thunder among them. Because in the end, it wasn't beauty or speed that ruled the war. It was survival, strength, and unbreakable will. And that is what the P-47 Thunderbolt delivered better than any plane ever built. By mid-1943, the Allied air campaign over Europe was reaching a breaking point. Daylight bombing raids were devastatingly costly, and the Luftwaffe's defenses seemed impenetrable. American bomber crews had a saying, "We can hit any target in Germany." What they needed was a guardian angel that could survive anything the enemy threw at it. That angel, ironically, came in the shape of a steel-armored brute, the P-47 Thunderbolt. The turning of the tide. At first, Thunderbolt pilots were out of their depth. They were up against seasoned Luftwaffe aces with years of combat experience. Early missions were chaotic, and the Thunderbolt's limited range meant pilots could barely cover bombers beyond the French border before turning back toward England. But every engagement taught them something new. They discovered the Jug's greatest strength wasn't grace, it was momentum. At high altitude, the P-47 could dive faster than any other aircraft in the sky. German fighters that tried to follow risked tearing their wings off. Pilots learned to use this to their advantage. Strike from above, fire in devastating bursts, and then dive away before the enemy could react. The Thunderbolt was a flying fortress in its own right. 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns that could shred a target in seconds. A single burst could turn a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf into scrap metal. And that's when the Luftwaffe began to take notice. The legend of Robert S. Johnson. Among those flying the Jug was a young American named Robert S. Johnson, a name that would soon echo across every Luftwaffe radio channel. On June 26, 1943, Johnson's squadron engaged German fighters near France. His Thunderbolt took fire almost immediately. Cannon shells ripped through his cockpit, shattered the canopy, and set his plane ablaze. He was wounded, blinded by smoke, and his oxygen system was destroyed. But somehow, the Jug kept flying. Johnson dove toward the clouds, trying to escape, when a Focke-Wulf 190 appeared on his tail. The German ace behind the controls couldn't believe what he was seeing. He emptied his guns into the P-47, riddling it with holes, yet the aircraft refused to die. Johnson's controls were nearly frozen, his fuel leaking, his instruments useless. But the Thunderbolt refused to go down. After what felt like an eternity, the German pilot pulled alongside, saluted, and flew away. He must have figured no man could survive a landing in that wreck. But Johnson did. He brought that shredded machine back to England, minus 200 bullet holes and all. From that day forward, the Luftwaffe learned to respect the Thunderbolt. The workhorse of the air war. As the months rolled on, the P-47 evolved. Drop tanks extended its range, allowing it to escort bombers deeper into German territory. The Thunderbolt became a shield for the daylight bombing offensive. But it wasn't just an escort fighter. It was transforming into something more terrifying. Low to the ground, the Jug was unstoppable. With bombs, rockets, and its devastating machine guns, it became the ultimate ground attack weapon. Bridges, railways, convoys, nothing was safe. The P-47 tore through enemy logistics with industrial efficiency. German troops nicknamed it the Juggernaut, or simply the Jabbo, short for Jagged Bomber, a name spoken with fear. Pilots began flying hundreds of sorties, hammering retreating German forces as the Allies advanced through Europe. The Thunderbolt wasn't sleek or elegant, but it got the job done. It could take hits that would destroy a Mustang or a Spitfire, deliver payloads like a small bomber, and still fly home on one engine. It was becoming clear this ugly plane was rewriting the rules of aerial warfare. Industrial might in the sky. Behind every Thunderbolt was the muscle of American industry. Republic Aviation's factories were running round the clock, churning out more than 15,000 aircraft before the war's end. Every one of them was a monument to mass production, aluminum, firepower, and horsepower assembled with relentless precision. The Thunderbolt was the physical embodiment of American scale. It was heavy, over-engineered, and built to win wars by attrition. While German aircraft production struggled under constant bombing, American plants flooded the skies with machines. The Thunderbolt didn't just fight the Luftwaffe, it outproduced it. A pilot's best friend. To the men who flew it, the Thunderbolt wasn't just a plane, it was a partner that refused to die. Countless stories emerged of pilots limping back home with wings shredded, cylinders blown, and half their control surfaces missing. The cockpit was a cocoon of armor, 300 pounds of protection that often made the difference between life and death. The P-47's rugged airframe could soak up punishment like no other fighter in the war. It was said that if you wanted to come home alive, you flew a Jug, and that reputation spread fast. By 1944, Thunderbolt units were dominating both the air war and the battlefield below. They destroyed over 86,000 enemy vehicles, 9,000 locomotives, and 6,000 armored vehicles, an unmatched record of destruction. The Flying Jug had become a symbol of unstoppable force, the rise of the Mustang. But just as the Thunderbolt reached its peak, another plane appeared on the horizon, the sleek, long-range P-51 Mustang. It was faster, lighter, and could escort bombers deep into Germany and back. For high-altitude dogfights, the Mustang became the new star. The Thunderbolt began to shift to a new role: ground attack, close air support, and battlefield dominance. But that didn't mean it faded away. In fact, the Jug became more indispensable than ever. It was the backbone of Allied tactical air power, clearing roads, cutting supply lines, and blasting tanks from the sky. While the Mustang got the glamour, the Thunderbolt got the job done.